Okay, I guess we can get started. All right, let's actually start.
Okay, yeah.
All right, welcome to the Howard Zinn Memorial Lecture Series. And we've had a great run of speakers so far, and tonight we also have another great speaker, Bruno Bosteels, a professor of Romance Studies at Cornell University, and he's also written several books such as Badiou and Politics and The Actuality of Communism, and he's the translator of Badiou's The Theory of Subject. These are all books you should read, and he's now going to talk to us tonight. So please, let's give a warm welcome to Bruno Bosteels.
Thank you, everybody. Maybe we could come a little closer. It's good to be back, and it's good to see that this is happening. I want to explain a little bit why I accepted to come and talk, and what the notion behind this, the project, and some of the events that have been going on that some of you may have heard about is all about. And to explain a little bit where these conferences around the idea of communism were coming from, and they have now, in a sense, been converging with some of the Occupy movements throughout the world. The idea was actually fairly simple, and it started when Alain Badiou wrote a text on the communist hypothesis that some of you I know have read, and suggested that communism is an idea that could be revived. And I think the important element in that argument, aside from any form that it would take, is the notion that there is obviously a long history to the notion of communism, and that there are ways of thinking about different sequences or different moments for the idea of a communist politics, a radically egalitarian politics, and that perhaps it's possible now to open up a new sequence, or at least begin arguing about this new sequence. We would be, in a sense, in a different period in which some of the older forms that this has taken obviously no longer work, and it's not a question of being nostalgic about any of those forms, but rather putting these ideas back on the table and see what they can produce. So I was arguing with some of my friends, and some of them were criticizing this idea of communism and believe that it's a completely utopian idea. And in fact, some of them believe it's kind of a dangerous idea in a bad sense, precisely because it would be so utopian. And I mentioned to some of these friends that, in fact, the simple idea that it is possible to talk about the history of different moments in communism, including in this country, which has a very long and extended history of various socialist and communist movements. Particularly, I think, a very important moment that perhaps for today is more relevant than any other is at the end of the 19th century, where anarchism and communism were trying to find mutual terms of agreement or disagreement. Figures like Johann or John Most, the German anarchist communist, and a lot of the events that were taking place in this very own country, I think, need to be picked up again. I talk about this a little bit in the book, that we are also, I think, responsible for writing or rewriting the history of those movements in this country and internationally, to see what we can learn, or in fact, more basically, what happened, because this has been forgotten as a result of decades of Cold War rhetoric, in which as soon as one mentions those words, they either sound totalitarian, and are easily dismissed, or simply as foreign imports, which they're certainly not in this case. So when I mentioned it to some of the friends I was talking about, Slavoj Žižek suggested actually we should do maybe a conference about this and get some people together to simply talk about the idea of communism. We had similar meetings about this in London. These were fairly academic events, conferences that maybe drew 40 or 50 people, about topics such as materialism, fairly abstract theoretical discussions. And when we started arguing about the possibility of organizing something on the idea of communism, this happened to coincide with the crisis of 2008, which meant that the attraction or the appeal of this conference sort of overtook the organizers, and they had to move the venue of this, and that led eventually in 2009 to the conference on the idea of communism, in which some of these ideas were debated. I participated in this. I'm not a philosopher, so my interest was in a sense more modest and pedestrian, and I started writing some of these essays that are put together under the title of The Actuality of Communism. And the title is actually, as many of you probably know, a reflection on a passage in the German ideology where Marx in the margin had written that communism is not an ideal, some kind of an ideal state to which reality would have to adjust itself. It is the actual movement that abolishes the current state of affairs. And he adds the conditions for this movement are already present in the actually existing premise, right, or the actual existing situation. So this notion that communism is not some utopian idea, some society that we are trying to establish or live up to, or that we would have to define and then see to what extent reality can match that ideal, but rather something that is going on, if you want, on the ground, that is a real, actual movement for the radical critique. At the same time, Marx is talking about a ruthless criticism of the current state of affairs, and that this movement, this enveloping movement that is actually part of the current situation, is much more attuned to the idea that he had of communism than any idea attributed to a certain utopian ideal for a future society. So I picked up on that idea by working from within a fairly theoretical corpus of texts. And my idea, my goal was mainly to see if those theoretical texts could be brought closer to some of the current events that were taking place. In other words, my question was to what extent some of these theoretical or philosophical ideas can open up a space in which they can be interpolated, they can be put to use, they can be polemicized with from the ground up, and to what extent perhaps some of those theories close off that possibility. In a sense, my impression was that some of the most sophisticated theoretical debates that were also highly, and are still very highly successful in so-called theoretical circles, were actually rather ill-disposed to getting involved in some of the movements that are going on currently, and that they actually provide more tools to cancel or block some of this rather than try to help foster the energy and the activities that actually would be part of such a real movement that could be called communism. So I think in particular, in the 80s and 90s, a certain criticism of notions, for example, of subjectivity, or of militancy, or of activism, of the intervention in actual politics, were being radically criticized from points of view that actually called themselves leftist, or thrived on the impression that to some extent they were attuned to a certain leftist ideal, but that once they were confronted with questions that came from a more radical sort of communist perspective, turned out actually to be rather nefarious, rather negative, or in fact working against the idea of an actual emancipatory form of politics. So I wrote these essays with that question in mind, how to bring together a certain form of activism and a certain form of theory. I think there are two main forms in which this relation has been articulated that need to be avoided. The first is basically the situation in which certain theorists or big philosophers come to events like this and in a sense, not so much jump on the bandwagon, but use the ideas in order to appropriate them as examples of what they are actually standing for. And I think the other extreme that needs to be avoided is the idea that the theorists or the philosophers are going to tell people what needs to be done. So it's in this tenuous space in between where I simply try to open up some of new spaces within the theory that hopefully could converge with what's going on. It's in light of that possibility that I accepted Doug's invitation to come and speak here. Now, I'm not, as I said before, a philosopher, so I took the liberty to sort of change the rhetoric a little bit, because I wanted to talk about a very simple question, which is the question: to what extent, in part as a result of Cold War rhetoric, in part as a result of self-criticisms of certain forms of leftism, it's been increasingly difficult to not only have collective actions that are not censored or immediately intervened, but simply even to say that there is such a thing as a collective we, that there is a possibility for a collective action in a specific space with a time of its own. So I wanted to talk about this, the creation of such a collectivity, of a we. When my oldest son heard that I was going to talk about this in the back of the car, he actually was very happy, because he thought that I was going to come and talk about the we, the W-I-I, because he didn't quite understand what this was all up for. And I wanted to talk about a certain poetics of the creation of a we and how this could come into being. I think there are at least two ways of reading the place of such a collective emergence in relation to that quotation that I just used. That communism is the actual movement that abolishes the current state of affairs. And I've had interesting debates about this following the publication of this book with my good friend Joshua Clover, who in a sense blamed me for misreading this passage from Marx. And he believed that I was interpreting the phrase movement, the Bewegung, in the actual movement that abolishes the current state of affairs, as a political movement. And that it was to some extent an organized movement of militant activism that had a clear program and that was going to be actual because it was going to be realized in actual interventions, actions, and in this sense create some kind of a historical movement. To which he opposed a different understanding of the question of a movement, and that it is actually, in a more, if you want, Hegelian sense, that is the movement, the very own movement of capital, which includes all those elements, that produces, in a sense, the critique and the overcoming of capital itself. And I think it's between those two readings that I wanted to raise the question of how a new collective we, the possibility of we could emerge. And to do that, I would like to turn to a completely different type of discourse, namely poetry. Because I think this has to do not only with tactics or strategies in a strictly political sense, but also with the simple possibility of talking in terms of a collective that emerges and identifies with a certain space, and that it can occupy a certain space. I think for all the limitations, that is perhaps the greatest virtue of the slogan, the 99%, in the sense that it creates a possibility not just of an easily identified enemy, but also of a collective that is no longer simply the moralizing we of the type, Michael Jackson, We Are the World, but also not the simple sort of 9/11 slogan that went around in Europe after the terrorist attacks, we are all Americans now, but rather a we that can start off from the place of the condemnation of class inequality and emerge as a collective that does not have to fear going back to some of the older terms of the debates of anarchism, socialism, or communism. A poet who has dealt with some of these same problems is Pablo Neruda. And he's also a good example of the kind of theoretical interventions that it has had, I think, negative effects on our contemporary discussions, because he is perhaps best known, aside from the songs of love, for his sort of epic poem Canto General, which was meant to be the Bible of Latin American history, geography, in a sense, a totalizing epic poem for and about Latin America. This poem contains a famous passage in which Neruda tries to speak in the name of everybody and presents himself as the poet who is going to speak for everybody, even including for the everyman, for the workers, for the invisible, for those who suffer. And he invites them to speak through his mouth. So I wanted to read you this passage before explaining why people have kind of attacked Neruda for this. Because it is obviously a vision of the poet as the mouthpiece of a gigantic collective movement, but that is focalized, that sort of has to pass through what he saw to be his own role. And he says, for example, if I can find it, dame el silencio, el agua, la esperanza, dame la lucha, el hierro, los volcanes, hablad por mis palabras y mi sangre. ¿No? Give me the silence, the water, the hope, the iron, the volcanoes, speak through my words and my blood. So this is the typical example of a case of a poet who's tried to speak in the name of a collective we, who has been viciously attacked for this very logic of being sort of the spokesperson. Throughout the 80s and 90s, in a certain ethical turn of much of the debates about culture and politics, this was a solution that seemed forbidden. One could no longer speak for anybody else. At best, one could bear witness before others, before those who were suffering or who were victims of oppression or poverty or exploitation, but never for them. And in a sense, this cancels out the possibility of speaking in the name of a collectivity. If one can no longer speak in the name of a collective, and I think this is sometimes a problem even in the General Assemblies that I've heard, in which everybody is asked to speak in their individual name and never in the name of a collective, never in the name of a larger us that could take shape in those very spaces, in those very moments. So instead of simply referring to the later Neruda, I wanted to quote, I think, one of the most interesting poems that he wrote earlier on in Residencia en la Tierra, Residence on the Earth, which is a so-called hermetic collection, 3 books of poetry, in which Neruda, in a sense, situates himself at an earlier stage of this question about how can a collective space be opened up. So I wanted to quote this. This is called Arte Poética, first in Spanish and then in English translation. I'm betraying my own nature here as a literary critic and not so much as a philosopher. So I think there has to be a space for this type of presentation as well. Entre sombra y espacio, entre guarniciones y doncellas, dotado de corazón singular y sueños funestos, precipitadamente pálido, marchito en la frente y con luto de viudo furioso por cada día de vida, hay, para cada agua invisible que bebo soñolientamente y de todo sonido que acojo temblando, tengo la misma sed ausente y la misma fiebre fría, un oído que nace una angustia indirecta, como si llegaran ladrones o fantasmas en una cáscara de extensión fija y profunda, como un camarero humillado, como una campana un poco ronca, como un espejo viejo, como un olor de casa sola, en la que los huéspedes entran de noche perdidamente ebrios, y hay un dolor de ropa tirada al suelo y una ausencia de flores, posiblemente de otro modo aún menos melancólico. Pero, la verdad, de pronto, el viento que azota mi pecho, las noches de substancia infinita caídas en mi dormitorio, el ruido de un día que arde con sacrificio, me piden lo profético que hay en mí, con melancolía y un golpe de objetos que llaman sin ser respondidos. Hay y un movimiento sin tregua, y un nombre confuso. And now I'll read you the English translation. Between shadow and space, between garrisons and maidens, endowed with a singular heart and mournful dreams, precipitately pale, withered the face, and with the mourning of a widower, furious for each day of life. Alas, for each invisible water that I drink sleepily, and for every second that I grasp trembling, I have the absent thirst and the same cold fever. An ear that is born, an indirect anguish, as if thieves or ghosts were arriving, and in a shell of a fixed and profound extension, like a humiliated waiter, like a bell a bit cracked, like an old mirror, like the smell of a solitary house in which the roomers enter at night, loosingly drunk, and there is a smell of clothing tossed to the floor, and an absence of flowers, possibly in some other way even less melancholic. But the truth, suddenly, the wind that strikes my chest, the nights of infinite substance dropped in my bedroom, the noise of a day that burns with sacrifice, they demand what is prophetic in me, with melancholy, and a crashing of objects which call without being answered, there is, and a movement without truce, and a confused name. So when I read this poem with some of my students, I always have been thinking about sort of writing, and you can find many of these poems in Neruda's text, but also in texts from the same time. This is around right before the Spanish Civil War by Cesar Vallejo. I've for a long time dreamt of writing a certain grammar of utopia, right? Sort of following really almost the syntax of how gradually you can see that something is happening and a certain subjectivity is emerging on the page through the very grammar of the poetry. And the task of such a grammar would be to define the moment of emergence, when something kind of a fictive extension, when Neruda talks about sort of as if thieves arrive at night, como si llegaron ladrones o fantasmas, or ghosts or phantoms. And this can be sort of added on to the existing situation, to everything that is out there, everything that aquello que hay, everything that is simply existing. But in Spanish, if you say I, which just simply means there is, it also sounds the same as I, A-Y, which is alas, sort of an exclamation of suffering or pain. So it is in an attempt to go beyond everything that is out there, everything that exists. And suddenly, there's a possibility that even Neruda calls it truth, a certain a moment of emergence in which you have sort of the infinite substance of the night that comes out and that interpolates the subject. The voice of the poet in this poem never speaks as sort of the mouthpiece of a movement in which everybody has to speak through the individual Nobel Prize winning poet, but rather it is the poet himself who is interpolated, who's called upon to perform something, to bring out that which is prophetic in him or her, and who never occupies the position of the subject of the sentence, even grammatically. And who is asked, me piden lo profético que hay en mí, without ever being allowed to occupy the subject position, but still capable of producing a new configuration, a new constellation of objects, right? And a movement, as he says, without truce, and also a confused name, un nombre confuso. I think, for me, this is, the confluence between some of the theoretical concerns and the concerns about the actual movements that are going on right now and that are part of a capitalist system that is in profound crisis and is trying to overcome itself, in a sense, thanks to this crisis. As we know, it is capable of doing that, perhaps to no end. But at the same time, a confused name, whether it's the 99%, whether it's the communist idea, or whether it is horizontalism, is emerging, that perhaps creates the possibility of a new collective we that no longer needs to be criminalized. Though, as the poet says, there is then this other way, perhaps even less melancholic, that is simply the sudden truth of a we that erupts in the emptiness of a solitary house, occupying a space of its void, like what he calls a shell of fixed and profound extension, like the space of a poem or a square or a park. Thank you very much. if there are questions.
Yeah, how about it? Some questions. Can we get somebody here to, well, I guess, does anybody want to ask questions? Is it really?
Yeah. Could you repeat what you just said? Because I just got here like 5 minutes ago.
I taped it, man.
No, but if you have questions, I basically tried to spin off a little bit. It wasn't directly on the book because I didn't know how technical or theoretical we wanted to get. But I'm open to any questions.
So how does your we stand against Badiou's generic and Marx's proletariat?
Ooh, good question.
Well, I think the obviously Badiou's notion of the generic is taken directly from the notion of species being and generic being. The difference being that in his case it's placed on truth that would be generic, right? And I actually this would be one of the numerous parts in which I think some of the older notions might still be very useful. The question about the proletariat brings out the difficult issue that this can not simply remain a generic we, right? And that these are, of course, the questions that immediately arise even about the slogan of the 99%. So once you have the possibility of perhaps saying we again, and you have an immediate identification in which people can say we are all part of the 99%, then the question becomes, well, but are there divisions? How is this related to not everybody is part of the 99% at the same time? And I still think that the virtue of the slogan remains as the possibility, which is perhaps in much greater, of which we are in much greater need today than the analytical virtues of the notion of the proletariat, which sort of anchors this in a specific place and class that could be the starting point for a movement that would be a total critique of the situation from within its most dense symptomatic location. I think the analytical virtues of that view are perhaps outweighed by the need to be able to revisit the history of past movements, to be able to restate the possibility of a collective we, and so it's a question of articulating something that's purely collective and generic with the specificity of what is going on in a specific context and in a specific situation. And I don't think that the question of the generic is going to help, obviously. You need other notions in order to be able to discuss that. But you see, the problem with many of the notions from within the tradition is that if they are anchored within the traditional debates, we know, of course, what the divides have been within the Marxist movement on those very questions, that it's going to close a lot of doors rather than fostering a new debate about the terms that are needed in order to understand and deal with the current situation.
There's a lot, I haven't heard very much, so I just was rereading on the train coming down from Lowell, and rereading your work, I was thinking in relationship to Occupy Boston and perhaps the Occupy movement in general. I was thinking about what some of the issues we've come up against, or it had internal debates about, or things that I feel like have become kind of maybe symptomatic of our movement. For instance, how do we approach the state right now? And also, how do we approach the question of self-representation when we are claiming as a we a kind of open category that has no definition? One, I think, kind of dominant notion within our camp even, and I haven't been around as much in the last 2 weeks as I had before, but I still think it's true, is that there's a sense that, well, since we aspire to be representative and horizontal and kind of non-hierarchical, how can we therefore speak until everyone's in the room with us? Right? That is to say, how can we, and this relates to the question of demands, but even beyond that, just the question there's been a lot of trouble, I'd say, or hesitation process-wise to even kind of propose a unity statement. Because the question of how can we represent when we're just a kind of stand-in for this broader kind of potentially empty kind of collective, or very of the 99%. And also similarly, there's been a lot of debate about should we make demands on the state? Is that or is that going to compromise the very purity of the movement? And there's various ways that purity is understood in a lifestyle way. Kind of we shouldn't engage with political demands at all. We should just grow this like a moss over the concrete or something like that. There's other ways, and just to suggesting that we're going to be drawn into a kind of a process that will render us either complicit or kind of remove our, kind of strip our independence away. I mean, I was really interested in your book, the way you discuss Linera, in Bolivia and Morales, and in the way in which you kind of challenge some of that, what you call specular leftism or whatever, that idea of like remaining separate and pure. At the same time, you also challenge the notion of kind of avoiding representation, as if you can have a notion of subjectivity that would bypass it, right? As if like we don't represent ourselves. If we can kind of avoid that, we can kind of therefore like avoid totalitarianism or authoritarianism or something down the line. Like this notion, this kind of conflation of the political and the theoretical that is often operative, I think, even in the left today. It's not really a question, but I mean, I wonder what you could say about the state and representation in relationship to Occupy right now.
No, I just need of making demands.
What's that?
Making demands. I
Well,
think that's
what-
very important. Like,
what do
now,
you-
should we or shouldn't
Should we? I mean, that would be, yeah, I mean, that would be one way to put it. Demands. She wants me to sharpen it by saying, what is your theory?
make demands?
Should we make demands, or what does it mean to make demands? What does your discourse have to contribute to that practical question of the movement?
Well, I would simply say one thing, which has to do with, I'm not sure that the critique of representation is going to be all that effective, like politically. I think
I mean,
the hesitation is not going. Yeah,
Right.
I think this stems from some of those theoretical debates that I think it now turns out maybe in terms of actual tactics, may be rather negative, right? Which is one is against representation, not even self-representation, and this sort of leads to this open multiplicity, which is of course itself also an illusion. And it's true that it has a certain purity, but I think it's a purity that's primarily ethical rather than political. And the question really becomes, are there ways of politicizing that purity, right? Which, of course, it also, because it is moral and ethical, it does have the virtue of